Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to St. John's Wood Synagogue. On behalf of the British Friends of Laniado, the Simon Wiesenthal Centre, and of course St. John's Wood Synagogue, it is my privilege to welcome you all here this evening. I'm Rabbi Yoni Golka, the Assistant Rabbi at the synagogue, and this large crowd here this evening is a testament to the importance of this event and a tribute to our guest speaker this evening, Melanie Phillips. The central theme of Pesach, which culminated last week, is how we learn from our past, the story of our people, and apply those lessons to our future. And this is really the very focus of this Yom HaShoah event. And it's exactly what St. John's Wood Synagogue stands for. We are a vibrant, modern Orthodox community, proud of our heritage and tradition, learning from our past and building for our future, creating a vibrant community in the 21st century, making Judaism relevant to one and all. On that note, I couldn't help but use this opportunity to leave some paperwork on your chairs with some upcoming events. So please do feel free not to join us only this evening, but for future events as well. Our co-hosts share these values. Laniado UK supports the outstanding, sterling work of Laniado Hospital in Israel, which was built as a life-affirming response to the devastation of the Holocaust. It is a testimony to the determination of one remarkable rabbi, Yekutiel Halberstam, also known as the Kloisenberger Rebbe, who lost his wife and 11 children and his entire devoted community of followers in the Holocaust. And with superhuman effort, he remained true to his faith and to his principles throughout the horrors of Auschwitz and the labor camps. He was admired by the prisoners around him, both religious and irreligious, and served as an inspiration to everyone in those dark hours. But it was during the death march, when he was faced with what was meant to be his final moments, that he made a promise that if he survived the war, he would build a hospital, which today, 70 years later, is one of the most prestigious, thriving medical centers in the region, a place focused on the value of every human life. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, too, is a global human rights organization researching the Holocaust and hate in a historic and a contemporary context. And it does outstanding work confronting anti-Semitism, hate, terrorism, promoting human rights and dignity, standing with Israel, defending the safety of Jews worldwide, and teaching and learning from the lessons of the Holocaust for future generations. When it comes to narrative, we are all pretty good at following the story of the Torah. When it comes to the book of Bereshit, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When it comes to the book of Shemot, the stories of the Exodus, of Passover. But then we get to the book of Vayikra. And most of us seem to get a little bit lost in all the complexities of the sacrificial service from the temple times. However, this week's portion in Vayikra, in Parshat Shmini, which we will read this coming Shabbat, the Torah tells us that Moses summoned a small group of people to give instructions about the type of offerings that should be brought and the consecration of the sanctuary. And the Torah begins, Vayihi bayom hashmini, it was on the 8th day, and Moses called to Aaron, to his sons, ulaziknei Yisrael, and to the elders of Israel. But then, when it actually comes to telling them the instruction of what to do, the Torah says that Moses speaks to Aaron and his sons. No mention of the elders of Israel. Why were they invited if they were not taking any type of role in this meeting? The Medrash comments that the elders were critical because just like a bird cannot fly without wings, so too the people of Israel cannot do anything without its elders. The commentators ask, it seems strange. Everything I do in my life, I need my grandparents to be there. What's the reason? They explain that the elders are the link to our past. They represent reassurance, the earlier generations, the wisdom of yesteryear. We live in a generation where we look up to our elders too, and especially survivors of the Shoah. And unfortunately, we live in a time where there are not so many survivors left. But we have a responsibility to carry this baton to our children, keeping their memory alive, learning from our past, the story of our people, and applying these lessons for our future. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now make the memorial prayer for the victims of the Shoah. El Molei Rachamim, Dayan Almanos Va'avi Yisomim, Al No Nechashev, V'tis Al Pek L'Dam Yisrael Shenishbach Kamayim, Hamsei Menocha Nechona, Al Kanfei HaShchina, B'malas Kedoshim V'Toharim, Kazoa Harakia Ma'irim Amazhirim, Es Nishmoseihem Shal Rivavos Alfei Yisrael, Anoshim v'noshim, Yilodim v'yilodos, Shenehergu v'nishchatu v'nisrofu v'nechnaku v'nikberu chayim ba'artzos Hasheneh naga bohen yad hatzoreh hagarmani v'grurov. Kulam kedoshim v'toharim, U'bohem ga'oinim v'tzadikim, Arzei halvonon adirei haTorah, B'gan Eden tehem menuchosom lochein, Bal harachamim yasdirein b'seisek knafov la'olamim, V'yitzor b'tzor ha'chaim es nishmosam, Adonai yunachnosam, v'yonuchu b'shalom am nishkavam, v'noimar, Amen. God full of mercy, justice of widows and father of orphans, please do not be silent and hold your peace for the blood of Israel that was shed like water. Grant fitting rest on the wings of the divine presence in the heights of the holy and the pure who shine and radiate light like the radiance of heaven, to the souls of the millions of Jews, men, women, and children, who were murdered, slaughtered, burned, strangled, and buried alive in the lands touched by the German enemy and its followers. They were all holy and pure. Among them were great scholars and righteous individuals, cedars of Lebanon and noble masters of Torah. May the Garden of Eden be their resting place. Therefore, Master of compassion, shelter them in the shadow of your wings forever, and bind their souls in the bond of everlasting life. The Lord is their heritage. May they rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. It now gives me great pleasure. Please be seated. It now gives me great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Alan Mendoza, the founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society. The Henry Jackson Society is a think tank and policy-shaping force that fights for the principles and alliances which keep societies free, working across borders and party lines to combat extremism, advance democracy and real human rights, and makes a stand in an increasingly uncertain world. Dr. Alan Mendoza is a frequent speaker at high-profile national and international events and conferences, and we are so delighted and honored that he has agreed to chair this evening's proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Alan Mendoza.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Golka. Thank you all for coming tonight for what I think will be a very revelatory evening. We have a fascinating topic of discussion. We have a brilliant speaker to deliver it, and I'm sure you have got some questions that you are going to ask on this subject about time to leave, whether it is indeed time to leave for Jews in Britain and Europe, based on some of the things we have all seen occur over the past few years. But before we move into our main event, I would very much like to invite Shimon Samuels to come and address you. Shimon is the Director of International Relations of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, one of course, tonight's sponsoring organizations. And for 30 years, he has led the line on issues to do with Holocaust remembrance, other factors around fighting anti-Semitism around the world in that organization and far beyond. I'm sure lots of you have seen him, have known his work throughout Europe and indeed the world. I think we all owe a great deal of gratitude, Shimon, to the work you've done on behalf of the Jewish people, but also for humanity in general, given the successes you've had in your work. So it gives me great pleasure to give you a short address, Shimon Samuels.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, first I would like to thank David Dangor from our board for making this evening possible, to our hosts, Rabbi Yoni and Jonathan Stewart, also of our board, my brother Graham Morris and David Oliver. We thank all the British board for this. Our annual lecture is in memory of Simon Wiesenthal, who was my mentor for almost 20 years. His axiom was, what starts with the Jews never ends with them. And I think that that can be applied to what we're about to discuss tonight. I've just arrived from Paris from UNESCO, a cloud cuckoo land circus, where 2 resolutions that are anti-Israel were passed, but they were passed with a consensus. I won't go into that tonight, it's a different story. What I would like to do is briefly speak about French Jewry, as a counterpoint for Melanie when she speaks about the UK. Last week, the CRIF, the Board of Deputies of France, announced that 60,000 Jews had left France in the past 10 years. They've gone to Israel, Quebec, Miami, and the UK. This, I believe, actually began 38 years ago when I first came to Paris. On the 3rd of October of that year, it was Erev Sukkot, and I went to visit the BBC correspondent, Tamar Golan. She was having a house guest for the weekend from Israel, Eliza Shagrir, the wife of the Israeli filmmaker. Eliza asked her, do you need anything for dinner? And she said, maybe a few figs. There's a fruiter around the corner. And I accompanied her to the corner. She turned into Rue Copernic, where a few moments later she met her death. The following morning, the Prime Minister of France, Raymond Barre, said that a bomb set for Jews killed 4 innocent Frenchmen. One was a Chinese waiter in the restaurant opposite, one was a Portuguese delivery boy on a bicycle, the third was a leaser, and the fourth was an innocent Frenchman. What happened after Copernic was it was a launch into 73 shootings and bombings of Jewish targets across Western Europe. I tabulated them. And it came to an end in 1982. Most people don't remember why, but Israel made an incursion into southern Lebanon. It was due to the coastal bus attack. And there were camps which were training European terrorists. They came back to their countries. They didn't care about Jews, they needed money. They attacked banks, they attacked NATO installations and embassies. Governments cracked down, and what started with the Jews didn't end with them. So that was the first wave. The second wave came with the Second Intifada, where young native-born Muslims in the slum rings around Paris and other cities were playing a game. Not cowboys and Indians, but Palestinians and Jews, or Palestinians and Israelis. And the unfortunate Jews who were their neighbors were victims of a tremendous amount of violence. The third wave began in 2015 with the assassination of Ilan Halimi, and it went on through the Toulouse school, and then from the Toulouse school we went on to the kosher supermarket. And with all of these events, it was compounded by jihadism and also the internet and social media. Today, we're in a situation after the brutal attacks on 2 elderly ladies, a situation which President Hollande had created as a state of siege. Suddenly, my office, which is in a community center, we arrived and there were 5 army men in uniform with submachine guns, and this was wonderful. Little by little, we became very friendly with them, but then Hollande decided to send them on walkabout. And then finally, they were taken away. I met with the Minister of the Interior, and I suggested that at least the day that you take them away for only financial reasons, say that there were 2,000 plainclothesmen, even if there isn't even one, as a deterrent. Didn't happen. Mr. Macron has cancelled the state of siege. Today, as a result, you have Jews who are leaving, you have synagogues which do not have the means to defend themselves, or it's a choice between security and culture, and security comes first. You have a situation where in our building we now have several classes of young kindergarten kids between 4 and 7 that are with us because they cannot be in unsafe premises as were their kindergartens. So what is happening as a result of all of this? Optimists say that there will still be 400,000 Jews in France, which is in fact enough to have a critical mass. Sergio della Pergola, the great demographer of the Hebrew University, told me that it's more likely 250,000, but that's the number of the Jews of Britain, and therefore it's still a critical mass. But there is something which is very perverse, and this is an ideological debate that is beginning between those who say, we are France, we are the true French, and it's redolent of the language of those German Jews in the 1930s who thought that their Iron Cross from the First World War would protect them. So there is in this debate a fear, and the fear is of neo-ghettoization, which means there is a word in France called communautarisme, which is a sin, community-bound. And it is a challenge to what is the secular religion of France, laïcité. So after the brutal murders of these ladies, fear is on the rise. Fear for one's children. Political polarization has meant that the extreme left is hostile and the extreme right is on the rise. And they're both being powered by the fear of immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa. Unfortunately, this situation will not improve. And as bleak as France is, this raises a question which I address to Melanie. The French Jews who came here to the UK, and I believe that there's even a French synagogue which is part of this complex, have they come here to a way station, or is it a solution? Thank you.
Well, that's your first puzzle riddle of the evening, but I'm sure it won't be the last either, because when we thought, or when the Simon Wiesenthal lecture was conceived, I don't think there could be a better speaker to give it than Melanie Phillips, because just as Simon Wiesenthal was a pursuer of truth, a lover of truth, someone who valued justice and wanted the world to know what had really gone on, what was going on in the world, so our speaker tonight, Melanie Phillips, has also made that one of her virtues throughout her long and distinguished journalistic career. Now, when you go outside later, and some of you already seen when you came in, there's a wonderful table full of Melanie's publications, a whole selection of them, her most recent one, a novel, The Legacy, which has moved into sort of creative writing in that sense, but also, of course, some of her earlier works in terms of the messaging that she has sent. And again, throughout her career, what she has tried to do in her newspaper writings, and let's not forget that she started on the left of politics. In fact, her autobiography, Guardian Angel, gives you a clue as to which newspaper she started with. Guardian, The Observer, moving to the Mail, moving to the Sunday Times, and moving to the Times today. Sort of a very interesting journey through the political spectrum as certain truths became more apparent to her along that path. You'll have obviously seen and heard her on Question Time, on the Moral Maze, on the BBC, many other places throughout. And again, throughout all of this, what you get with Melanie Phillips is the unvarnished truth. She does not shy away from the big issues of the day. She will tell things to people that they would rather not hear. And I must say, we have to thank her for that, because too often people shy away from the big battles of the day, do not debate them, and as a result, the big questions get swept under the carpet, when in reality they need to be brought front and center to be debated. To learn more about Melanie, you can go onto her website, www.melaniephillips.com, where you'll see a whole selection of her works of various kinds and can sign up to her mailing lists. But I think enough for me. I think we want to hear, Melanie, what you have to say about whether the end is nigh or whether there is indeed some hope. Melanie Phillips.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. Good evening, everybody. It's a very great pleasure to be here. And I am really so very honoured to have been asked to deliver this Simon Wiesenthal Memorial lecture on this Yom HaShoah. Simon Wiesenthal Center, it's a legendary institution to me and to so many of us. It does such amazing work, as we've heard a little, confronting anti-Semitism and hatred and terrorism and teaching the lessons of the Shoah and defending the safety of Jews around the world. And how very tragic and sad it is, unfortunately, that we need the Simon Wiesenthal Center today more than ever before, it would seem. I'm very grateful to Rabbi Golka and the St. John's Wood Shul for hosting me. I'm grateful to the Simon Wiesenthal Center itself and to David Dangur, who first approached me to deliver this lecture, and to everybody who has helped organize this event with such efficiency and such warmth towards me. Thank you very much indeed. Well, as we've just heard a little from Shimon Samuels, these are very alarming times for Jews in Britain and in Europe. Here in Britain, as I'm sure you have all been eagerly consuming the newspapers day after day, I'm sure you can't get enough of more news about the Labour Party. But here the Labour Party is convulsed over the realization that it is absolutely riddled with anti-Semitism. We read with some astonishment that Jeremy Corbyn, the friend to Hamas, has been exposed as belonging to Facebook groups which host claims that, for example, the Jews were behind ISIS and 9/11, or that the Rothschilds controlled the world's finances, or a host of other such paranoid theories. And the backwash from these revelations has revealed, in turn, a positive tsunami of anti-Jewish insults, smears, and libels by the wider family of Labour supporters. Jeremy Corbyn's responses to this crisis, often truculent and insulting to the Jewish community, has only deepened the sense of crisis that is now engulfing the Labour Party, so that some people feel in the party that it's actually an existential crisis for the party. But this is only one element of the broader picture. Last year, according to the Community Security Trust, which keeps us all safe and does sterling work in its own right, last year saw, according to the CST, the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents in Britain since the CST started recording such data in 1984. Now, normally, as the CST observed, surges in such incidents occur in response to the reporting of Israeli military action that incites feeling against Jews more generally, and that's obviously disturbing enough. But what's more disturbing in these latest statistics is that this record surge in anti-Semitic incidents had occurred in the absence of any such Israeli activity, military activity, or any particular incidents which might have caused a spike. It just happened. Worse is happening in mainland Europe, as we have heard from Shimon Samuels. In Paris last month, an 85-year-old survivor of the Shoah, Mireille Knoll, was stabbed to death and her body burned by a young Muslim she'd apparently known since he was a child. Last year, a man shouting Allahu Akbar beat up an elderly Jewish schoolteacher, Sarah Halimi, and threw her to her death out of her Paris apartment window. In January of this year, a teenage girl in the Paris suburb of Sarcelles, wearing the uniform of her Jewish school, was slashed in the face with a knife. Later that month, an 8-year-old boy was beaten in the same area because he was wearing a kippah. In February, 2 Jewish men in Paris were attacked with a hacksaw amid a volley of anti-Semitic abuse. In Amsterdam, a kosher restaurant which has been repeatedly targeted for attack had its windows smashed last month by a man holding a Palestinian flag and shouting Allahu Akbar. Holland's chief rabbi says taunts in the street of dirty Jew or curses against Jews are now quite normal. At the beginning of Hanukkah last year, 2 Syrians and a Palestinian firebombed the synagogue in Gothenburg in Sweden. A few days later, a Jewish cemetery in Malmö in Sweden was attacked. In Germany, the Israeli flag has been burned and Jewish pupils bullied by Arab schoolmates. and so on and on and on. In May of last year, a Pew Institute survey asked 2,000 people living in each country in Eastern and Central Europe questions about their attitudes to Jews. 20% of respondents said they didn't want Jews in their country. 30% didn't want them as neighbours. In Romania, 22% wanted to revoke the rights of citizenship for Jews, and 18% of Poles said the same thing. Across Europe, a range of nationalist parties and groups are on the rise, amongst which there are some disturbing associations with anti-Semitism and with fascism. So, many Jews are asking, isn't this 1933 all over again? Isn't it the Weimar Republic, which enabled the rise to power of German Nazism, all over again? Isn't history just repeating itself? Well, yes and no. Yes, we can all hear the unmistakable echoes. In particular, we can recognize the refusal once again to acknowledge the true nature and extent of a gathering threat, not least that refusal amongst Jews themselves. But there are certain key differences. Nazi Germany involved a state policy of genocide. Today, European governments may be ineffectual in resisting Islamist extremism or defending their Jewish populations against the broader anti-Semitism coursing through their societies. But this time, the people of Britain and Europe are passionately opposed to what they also see as a threat to their way of life, and are determined to restore and defend their nations and Western culture and the commitment to human rights that informs that culture. There are three different sources of anti-Semitism in Britain and in Europe. There is the anti-Semitism on the left, there is the anti-Semitism on the right, and there is the anti-Semitism in the Muslim community. All these threats to the Jews are connected to each other. All are rooted in turn in broader threats to Britain and to Europe themselves, and all are creating a perfect anti-Jewish storm. Let's look first at the threats from within the Islamic world. The threats to Britain and Europe themselves are coming both from within and from without. From without, from outside Britain and Europe, they're coming from Islamism and Islamization. And when I say outside, of course, there are Muslims inside Britain and Europe who are carrying this, but the culture comes from outside Britain and Europe. From within Britain and Europe, the threats are coming from an anti-Western view of the world, which also refuses to identify correctly and combat the Islamist threat from without. So it's both undermining the West and, in turn, undermining the defense of the West against the threats from without. Now, the nature of this Islamist threat takes several forms. There are the constant eruptions of terrorist violence. The vast majority of terror attacks in Britain and Europe are committed by Islamic extremists. Intelligence officials here say 23,000 jihadis are in Britain, posing some degree of a terrorism risk, with 3,000 of them, only 3,000 of them, under investigation or active monitoring. Then there is sexual violence. In Britain, we've had the grooming and pimping gangs, overwhelmingly composed of men of Pakistani Muslim heritage, targeting specifically and deliberately young white girls who are considered to be white trash. In Germany and Sweden, those countries have seen a huge rise in rape and sexual violence associated with Muslim migrants. You probably haven't read much about any of that, because it's Islamophobic even to talk about it. Then there's cultural attack. You may recall here the Trojan horse infiltration of schools in Birmingham by Muslim extremists aiming to force them to conform to Islamic precepts. The infiltration of Labour Party constituencies, as attested by one or two very brave Labour members of Parliament, in order to force the party to conform to Muslim demands. Despite all of this and more, Britain and Europe refuse to acknowledge that the Islamist threat is based upon religious fanaticism, upon an interpretation of Islam which, although it is not supported by many Muslims, and indeed Muslims are the most numerous victims of this particular interpretation of Islam, is nevertheless dominant within the Islamic world. Instead, identifying these threats as rooted in Islam is damned as Islamophobic, and we are not allowed to talk about it. Since any criticism of Islam is deemed Islamophobic, there is, in turn, a refusal to acknowledge the enormous problem of Muslim anti-Semitism. Yet, this is one of the principal drivers of the Islamic threat, not just to Jews, but to the West in general. Islamist ideologues and jihadis believe that modernity is the great threat to Islam, modernity has to be resisted and destroyed, and that the Jews are the demonic creators of that modernity. Paranoid conspiracy theories and other deranged falsehoods about Jews pour out of the Islamic world in an unstoppable torrent, but it is Islamophobic to talk about it. Opinion polls consistently show that hatred of Jews is far more prevalent amongst Muslims than in the wider community. The Muslim journalist here, Mehdi Hassan, wrote in 2013, quote, "Anti-Semitism isn't just tolerated in some sections of the British Muslim community. It's routine and commonplace. It's our dirty little secret." Close quote. But of course, if you're not Mehdi Hassan, it's Islamophobic to talk about it. The CST figures suggest that a disproportionate number of Muslims are involved in anti-Jewish attacks. The figures for 2017 show that out of 420 anti-Semitic offenders of whom an ethnic description was obtained, 238 were described as white Europeans, 77 as black, 75 as Asian, and 30 as Arab or North African. Muslims are officially estimated to comprise just over 4% of Britain's population. Although it's not possible to be exact, the proportion of Muslim offenders in the CST figures would seem to be several times more than 4%, but it is apparently Islamophobic to draw attention to that. Now, let me be plain. We do all have a duty. We have to be extremely careful not to promote prejudice against Muslims, just as we should not promote prejudice against anyone at all. And we must bear in mind that there are many, many Muslims in this country and around the world who are not only opposed to Islamist extremism, but are its most numerous victims. It threatens them too. But in turn, there is enormous pressure not to acknowledge the threats to life and liberty that are widespread within the Muslim world, including anti-Semitism. Anyone who actually calls out those threats for what they are is denounced as a bigot. But those who do so, those who damn the people who are trying to draw attention to this threat, themselves are conniving at the perpetration of continuing Muslim Jew hatred. Now, the reason no one is allowed to talk about Muslim anti-Semitism is the cultural prism through which left-wing progressive circles rule the world, or rather view the world. The left-wing progressive circles rule our culture. They dominate our culture. The academics, the universities, the media, the cultural establishment, the political establishment. They are all basically subscribing across the political aisle to a particular view of the world. And this represents the threat from within. I would call it anti-West left-think. Now, this left-wing prism is responsible for eroding Western values, for undermining the defense of Britain and Europe against the jihad, and for exposing Jews to attack. And these three things are all connected. My suggestion is that you cannot begin to understand the resurgence of paranoid, unhinged anti-Semitism unless you understand that the West has been tearing up the very idea of reason itself, along with the moral codes at the heart of Western civilization. Now, it took me a very long time to put all this together and to realize that in turning against the Jews, the West was also turning against itself. And I chart this painful journey that I myself have taken in my recently published memoir, Guardian Angel, which is on sale outside. But this is how the left has become the enemy of the West and the enemy of the Jews. Leftists view the West as the historic and current oppressor of the entire developing world. Now, this Western cultural self-hatred has a complex history, at the root of which I would suggest lies the erosion of biblical morality by the tides of secularism. But in my view, the key political driver of this cultural demoralization in Europe and the West was the Shoah, the Holocaust. This simply smashed to smithereens Europe's belief in itself as the exemplar of superior cultural values. The Holocaust was conceived and directed, after all, in the heartland of high European culture, the supposed crucible of enlightenment and rationality. It wasn't just the Jews, therefore, who died in the extermination camps. It was also, I would suggest, the West's concept of itself as moral and rational. Lethally demoralized, Western cultural elites then took an axe to the building blocks of their civilization that had so catastrophically and grotesquely failed in the Shoah. They took an axe to education as the transmission of that civilization, an axe to the traditional family as the best way to generate emotionally resilient inheritors of that civilization, and an axe to national identity itself as the political expression of that civilization. Policies and laws passed by national governments in the West now had to take second place to transnational institutions and laws. Transnationalism was considered morally superior because it kind of stood proxy for the brotherhood of man, as opposed to individual nations, which, because they were particular and exclusive, inevitably and innately, it was thought, stood for bigotry and prejudice and hatred of the other. So democratic Western governments had to take second place to transnational institutions and laws such as the United Nations, the European Union, or international human rights laws. With no Western nation or Western values thought worthy anymore of defending to the death, wars to establish justice and freedom were replaced by conflict resolution, negotiation, peace processes. Between God and the devil, Western liberals would split the difference and broker a triumphant compromise. National identity was replaced by factional interest groups. Morality was replaced by a Marxist view of the world based on competing power blocks. Biblical morality was replaced by man-made, universalizing ideologies such as moral and cultural relativism or multiculturalism. Now, every one of these ideologies was anti-Judaism or anti-Israel. Jews, after all, are always in the way of any universalizing ideology. We are the people of one book alone and of one land alone. We are ha'ivrim, the people from the other side, the people who have always dwelled alone, something many diaspora Jews try to deny, something our postmodern culture will not accept, and something which has helped fuel the madness over Israel. It's a commonplace, isn't it, that the hatred of Israel on the left was caused by the Israeli David turning into Goliath after the Six-Day War. Well, I would suggest that doesn't even begin to explain the madness over Israel. Anti-Israelism, if I can call it that, has exactly the same characteristics that make traditional anti-Semitism a unique form of derangement. Both are based entirely on falsehoods and malicious distortions. Both single out Israel and the Jews for double standards and treatment afforded to no other nation, people, or cause. Both accuse Israel or the Jews of crimes of which they are not only innocent, but are in fact the victims. Both dehumanize Israel or the Jewish people. Both impute to Israel and the Jewish people demonic global conspiratorial power. Both are utterly beyond reason. Yet on the left, this connection between anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism is vehemently denied. The treatment of Israel is described as mere criticism of its behavior. But it isn't criticism at all. Criticism is rational. This is irrational and malicious demonization and delegitimization of Israel and of Zionism. Zionism is merely the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their historic homeland. This anti-Zionism, therefore, singles out the Jews alone for the destruction of their nationhood. The distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is bogus. As might be said, it is fake news. As Professor Ruth Weiss has observed, quote, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism combined into the modern phenomena of anti-Semitism-Zionism can best be described as the organization of politics against the Jews. This is the new anti-Semitism. But trying to understand it, this new anti-Semitism, is a bit like peeling a rotten onion. Beneath every rancid layer lies a yet more rancid layer. So let me peel this onion for you. The outermost visible layer is fairly obvious. The left, in general, now subscribes to beliefs which were once considered confined to the extreme left. The left has absorbed the Marxist concept that everything has to be understood in terms of political power. The world is divided into the powerful and the powerless. Those with power can never be good. Those without power can never be bad. Those who make money have power over those who don't make money. Those who make money are bad. Those without money are good. Jews make money, therefore Jews are powerful and bad. The 19th century German anti-Semite Wilhelm Marr, who is credited with inventing the term anti-Semitism, ascribed to the Jews, I think for the first time, this attribute of global power. Israel, which isn't really Western at all, and therefore, according to this definition, not really powerful, but no one really knows that, they all think it's a Western country, Israel is seen as menacingly powerful. That is its crime, its power, and that is also why anti-Israelism is umbilically connected to anti-Semitism. The fact that Jews are now equipped with military power in Israel merely to defend themselves against annihilation breathes life, nevertheless, into the paranoid delusion that the Jews are so powerful they pose a threat to everyone else. The next layer of the anti-Israelism onion is even more rank. This is that, as the black joke that isn't a joke at all would have it, the West will never forgive the Jews for the Holocaust. This isn't just because of the terrible legacy of guilt carried by the West, but because of jealousy. What, you may ask, is the West so jealous of when it comes to the Holocaust? What on earth can they be jealous of? Well, what the West is jealous of is what it perceives as the Jews' trump card of victimhood. I've heard it said over and over again that the Jews suck up all the victimhood in the world and leave no room for anyone else to be a victim. What on earth does this nonsensical claim mean? It can only mean one thing, that the enormity of the crime against the Jews in the Shoah was so vast that any victim status claimed by anyone else is rendered minor by comparison and thus devalued. Okay, but why do these people want to be considered victims in the first place? What's so wonderful about being a victim? Surely we'd all prefer not to be victims. Well, what's so wonderful is that it gives them a moral free pass. The belief is that you can't be held responsible for your own misdeeds if you are a victim. If you are a victim, you can never be a victimizer, you can never be a racist, you can never be a genocidal psychopath. And so it follows that in the developing world, which is the victim of the capitalist West, in the developing world, no one can ever be a victimizer, a racist, or a genocidal psychopath. People in the developing world can only themselves be the victims of such people. The Palestinian Arabs can only ever be the victims of such people. And as such, the Palestinian Arabs and the rest of the developing world get a get-out-of-jail-free card for everything, including genocidal mass murder. So, now every group that does not conform to the left-wing definition of power, deemed to be, of course, male, pale, heterosexual, Western, every such group claims victim status and that get-out-of-jail-free card for their behavior. That's why we have our victim culture. But I hope you realize Jews cannot be victims because, as everyone knows, they emerged from the Holocaust to run the financial world, the media, the law, the arts, American foreign policy. The Jews are all powerful. They cannot be victims. Yes, of course, the Jews are, in fact, the most persecuted people on earth, who even now are having to sacrifice their children in Israel to defend themselves year in, year out against genocidal fanatics bent on their extermination. So how can that fact not be recognized? And here's where we peel down to the most sickening layer of the putrid onion. For the real reason, I would suggest, for the burning resentment against the Jews over their status as supreme victims, is that it is thought the Holocaust enabled the Jews to get away with it. Get away with what exactly, you may ask? Well, get away with all that stuff that anti-Semites think about the Jews, that they are rapacious and disloyal and grasping and out to control the world and all the rest of it. In other words, such people really do think that those anti-Semitic libels are actually true, and that the Jews' status as ultimate victims of the Holocaust has silenced people from uttering those truths about the Jews, and that's not fair. Well, it was reaction by anti-Semites to the Holocaust, I would suggest, which created our invidious victim culture in the first place, and this is why. People thought that if the Jews had got a free pass for their misdeeds, then so too could any group that claimed to be victims. The difference is that while victim groups thus claim impunity for acts of irresponsibility, abuses of power, or other bad behavior, the Jews are wholly innocent of the crimes that anti-Semites so falsely lay at their door. So victim culture is innately anti-Jew, and victim culture lies at the very heart of progressive left-wing thinking. Moreover, support for Palestinianism, the left's signature cause of conscience, is also innately anti-Jew. So-called Palestinian identity is a fiction which was invented solely to exterminate the uniquely, historically, and legally valid Jewish claim to the land of Israel. Mahmoud Abbas, viewed by the Western left as a moderate entitled to a state, has a doctorate in Holocaust denial. He explicitly venerates the wartime Palestinian Nazi ally Haj Amin al-Husseini and uses his media outlets to transmit Nazi-style demonization of the Jews. This very week, Palestinian Authority TV grotesquely misrepresented a photograph of concentration camp victims as Arabs and wrote that Jews burned the Arabs in Nazi ovens. Every single person who supports the Palestinian cause connives at promoting this murderous anti-Jewish filth. So why should Labour Party members who support the Palestinian agenda of Holocaust denial, attacks on Judaism, and unhinged conspiracy theories about Jewish power now be so shocked that Labour Party members are coming out themselves with Holocaust denial, attacks on Judaism, and unhinged conspiracy theories about Jewish power? The fact is that the new anti-Semitism is a seamless robe of Israel hatred and Jew hatred. People deny this because they think anti-Semitism is only against Jews as people. They just can't recognize it when it's against the collective Jew in the state of Israel. Furthermore, the left believe they embody virtue. They are anti-racist, so they can't possibly be anti-Semitic. Only people on the right can be anti-Jew. Well, this is historically and philosophically illiterate. Both left and right have the same parent in the counter-Enlightenment and German Romanticism. This spawned in due course both communism and fascism. Karl Marx wrote, quote, "What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money." Left-wingers, however, are constitutionally unable to accept that they can be racist or anti-Semitic because by undermining their own self-image of unimpeachable moral purity, this would destroy their entire political and moral personality. So they shelter behind the fiction that hating Israel is decent and moral, while hating Jews is beyond the pale. We can hear this self-serving rubbish from some who now claim to have seen the light about Labour Party anti-Semitism and who now say they realize they were wrong to blame all Jews for the crimes of Israel. This is considered, I suppose, progress in their minds. Anti-Israelism is inescapably anti-Jew, yet anti-Israelism is the default position in progressive circles. So even if Jeremy Corbyn were deposed tomorrow, anti-Semitism on the left would not disappear. The symbiosis between hatred of Israel and hatred of Jews is now part of the DNA of the progressive world. Yet because these progressives believe anti-Semitism is to be found only on the nationalist right, the very same left-wingers who obsessionally anathematize Israel, support its Arab would-be destroyers, and are struck dumb about Muslim anti-Semitism in Europe, strike a note of pious concern about anti-Semitism among European nationalists. Yet although some of those nationalists do indeed have very troubling anti-Semitic or fascist overtones, Jews, I would suggest, have much more to fear from the people that those nationalists are trying to stop. A German government study published in January found that male migrants might be responsible for more than 90% of the recent increase in violent crime in Germany. In Sweden, a leaked report last year revealed that there were now 61 Islamic no-go zones where Islamist extremists had taken over. Sweden's National Police Commissioner pleaded, help us, warning that the police could no longer uphold the law and administer justice in Sweden. Across Europe, the entire political establishment has for years connived at or turned a blind eye to the mass immigration of mainly Muslim migrants and the steady march of Islamization, the evidence for which is demonstrated, not least by the attempt to criminalize as Islamophobic any criticism of the migrants or any concern about the resulting erosion of Western culture. As a result of this wholesale political and cultural disenfranchisement across the board, the peoples of Europe are now turning to parties outside the political establishment which promise an end to mass uncontrolled immigration. For this, The voters of Europe are dismissed as bigots and xenophobes. The aggressive or anti-Semitic behavior by many migrants is ignored or denied. Instead, those who want to stop this influx are demonized as racists and anti-Semites. The president of the European Jewish Congress, Dr. Moshe Kantor, says right-wing populist parties are resorting to both anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant discourse to gather political support. Well, let's look at one of these such people. In Hungary, the newly re-elected Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been painted as a racist and anti-Semitic monster. Racist because he wants to stop Muslim immigration into Hungary, anti-Semitic partly because he praised as an exceptional statement Miklos Horthy, the architect of Hungary's Nazi alliance and the overseer of the deportation to their slaughter of most of Hungary's Jewish population. Orban previously denounced Horthy as having collaborated with the Nazis, but Orban also felt threatened by the rise of Jobbik, a truly anti-Semitic Hungarian party. And so Orban's volte-face in praising Horthy was likely to be opportunistic in trying to prize away Jobbik supporters. Orban is also accused of anti-Semitic language in his fierce attacks on the Hungarian Jewish financier George Soros. But there are legitimate concerns about the billionaire Soros, who, through his NGOs, bankrolls a global agenda of hostility to core Western cultural values and the nation state, including the State of Israel, at every opportunity. Orban has accused Soros of being behind the many open borders NGOs putting pressure on Hungary to open its doors to migrants, which Orban says would threaten Hungarian national identity. For this, Orban is called a racist. However, Soros himself has lent credence to Orban's claim that Soros is trying to undermine Hungarian national integrity when Soros wrote, quote, his, that is to say Orban's plan, treats the protection of national borders as the objective and the refugees as an obstacle. Our plan treats the protection of refugees as the objective and national borders as the obstacle, which is precisely what Orban is saying. He wants to defend the integrity of Hungary. For that, he is, of course, a racist. Moreover, among the people that Soros's NGOs support are people like the anti-Semites in Black Lives Matter and groups that are venomously anti-Israel. No matter, none of that is alluded to. Instead, it's the person trying to stop him who's accused of anti-Semitism. Now, I'm not trying to sanitize Viktor Orban. He may well have unscrupulously used anti-Semitic dog whistling to advance his political career. But nevertheless, some Hungarian Jews have praised his unequivocal rejection last year of Hungary's fascist past, when Orban said the country had committed a sin in not protecting its Jewish citizens during the war. One Hungarian Jewish leader, after acknowledging the anti-Semitic overtones of the anti-Soros campaign and the government-led campaigns to rehabilitate Nazi collaborators, which has disturbed so many of us, this Jewish leader said, nevertheless, quote, the Jewish community in Hungary is threatened not by these issues, but by Islamic violence and bans on ritual slaughter, both of which Orban opposes, close quote. In France, Jews are being murdered by Muslims. In Sweden, the Netherlands, and elsewhere, Jews are being attacked, threatened, and intimidated. So who, ladies and gentlemen, do you think poses the greater threat to Jewish safety? The governments of Europe, who are doing nothing to stop this influx, which so greatly increases the threat to the Jewish communities, or Viktor Orban? But Orban, of course, fits the stereotype of what so many people think an anti-Semite should look like. Accordingly, he's being hyped up as an enemy of humanity to obscure the reality of the new anti-Semitism and its sources in anti-Israel derangement and the genocidal fanaticism within the Muslim world. There is no doubt, though, that there is an enduring strand of virulent indigenous anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. Research suggests that almost 1 in 5 Hungarians openly demand the immigration of the Jews. In Poland, the government there is intent upon denying its own anti-Semitic past. A new law that it's passed criminalizes anyone who accuses Poland of having been complicit in the Holocaust. As it happens, I've written a novel, The Legacy, which has been published this week. You can also see it outside, and which deals with this very issue. And I have to say, my novel even features a walk-on role for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Those who deny their anti-Semitism are doomed to repeat it. So it is in Poland. Anti-Semitic outbursts there in the media and among politicians have hugely increased since that law's passage last February, with wild claims about Jewish conspiracies and even comparisons of Jews to animals. So, traditional old-style anti-Semitism is unfortunately still very prevalent in countries with a terrible history of persecuting the Jews. Some of the new ultra-nationalist parties coming to the fore in Europe, such as the Austrian Freedom Party, Golden Dawn in Greece, or Jobbik in Hungary, are openly anti-Semitic or have Nazi pasts. Others, though, other nationalist groupings, merely want to restore and defend national identity, democratic national sovereignty, and Western cultural norms and practices against creeping Islamization. Yet all parties committed to the defense of Western cultural norms and national identity in Europe are being damned equally as racist, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic. In Britain, the government's failure over many years to identify correctly and tackle Islamist extremism is turning the Jewish community into collateral damage. The refusal to acknowledge that the problem of Islamist extremism is particular to Muslim culture, although, as I have said, many Muslims are opposed to such extremism. This has meant that government strategy for dealing with that extremism has involved imposing equal restrictions upon all religious practices it considers to lie outside the liberal consensus, such as the refusal to teach sexuality in ultra-Orthodox Jewish schools. Throughout Europe, there are growing pressures to ban circumcision and ritual slaughter. This liberal, secular intolerance poses a real threat to religious Jewish life in Britain and in Europe. British Jews themselves, however, are so reluctant to call out Muslim extremism. Recently, the chief rabbi broke cover to complain that Muslim leaders were silent in the fight against rising anti-Semitism in Europe. He said, "The threat to Judaism and Jews from the world of Islam is one which can only be cured from within the world of Islam." Quite right. But Jewish leaders themselves years ago urged the Cameron British government, to its astonishment and no inconsiderable irritation, it urged Mr. Cameron to admit many more Muslim migrants. And Jewish leaders appear, I'm afraid, more anxious to make common cause against Islamophobia, which seeks to silence criticism of unacceptable Islamist and Muslim practice, more anxious to make common cause against Islamophobia and xenophobia than to bring the full extent and nature of Muslim anti-Semitism into the open. More dangerous still, Jews on the left who promote multiculturalism and campaign loudly against Islamophobia are themselves helping stoke anti-Semitism. This is why. People who are angry and resentful at the way mass immigration is destroying their national identity bitterly resent being told by diaspora Jews who have their own refuge in Israel, even though they think they will never need it, it's there for them. Those people who are so upset and frantic about the destruction of their British or European national identity bitterly resent being told by diaspora Jews that it's racist to oppose multiculturalism. Not only is it dangerous from the point of view of promoting anti-Semitism for Jews to oppose Europeans having their own national identities, it is morally wrong. We Jews have ours. Why can't they have theirs? In Britain, most Jews voted against Brexit. They are frightened by assertions of national identity. They think national identity leads to nationalism, and that means anti-Semitism. They think Europe protects against anti-Semitism, and that Brexit is motivated by nationalism and by racism and by xenophobia. Haven't they noticed that the rise of the ethno-nationalist groups in Europe, some of which are truly anti-Semitic and xenophobic, and which frighten British Jews so much, haven't they noticed that the rise of these groups has taken place under rule by and precisely because of the European Union? Jews are protected only when a country feels confident and strong, which is, and please don't faint, in my view, Brexit offers a sliver of hope. The revival of British national identity may, over time, see off group rights and identity politics, which threaten the liberties of so many. Greater cultural and national confidence here in Britain, and I would suggest in the countries of Europe, would mean more tolerance of Jews, not less. So here are some closing thoughts before I actually get to my conclusion. Why is anti-Semitism on the rise in the West? Broadly because the West is in deep cultural trouble, and a society in trouble always, always turns on the Jews. So much general hatred and irrationality now courses through the West, a symptom of the cultural trouble the West is in. I mean, you've only got to look at Twitter or social media to see so much hatred that's pouring out against anyone and anything. So why should anyone be surprised that Jew hatred is now so prevalent just on that score alone? But I would suggest anti-Semitism is not just a prejudice, a type of bigotry, a type of hatred. It's much, much more than that. Anti-Semitism represents a kind of moral and spiritual death. Europe lost its soul in the Shoah, the soul that had been created by Jewish biblical precepts. Turning upon itself, Europe has turned on the Jews. Without its Christian base, the West is nothing, but Christianity in Britain and Europe lost their way a long time ago. Losing their faith, many Christian churches turned instead to social and political activism, liberation theology, and the radical Marxist analysis of the World Council of Churches. Those progressive churches have denied their Jewish parent, embracing instead their Islamic assassin in the misguided hope of saving their flock. These churches, are in the forefront of the charge against Israel. I have to say, some of the most devoted and passionate supporters of Israel are Christians. In fact, they are much more devoted and passionate in their support of Israel than many Jews. Nevertheless, progressive churches are in the forefront of the charge against Israel. And in the process, these churches are destroying themselves and the Christianity they represent. But a society without a religious core rests on sand. So to conclude, many Jews, especially those on the left, see no problem with mass Muslim immigration except for Islamophobia. Such Jews are either indifferent to Israel or they may believe many of the lies told about it. Indeed, tragically, so many of the leaders of the new anti-Semitism are themselves Jews. And this is a tragedy that has dogged us throughout our history, that some of the people who have led us to the slaughter have been Jews. For all these people, the idea that it may be time now for the Jews to leave Britain and Europe is no more than paranoid hysteria. For other British and other Jews, the current situation is, however, deeply, profoundly upsetting and lowering. The anti-Semitism here is bad enough, but it's not just the anti-Semitism that's so devastating, is it? It's the reaction towards those who call it out for what it is. Because the same people who claim to see anti-Semitism in European populism or in the rise of Donald Trump, the same people regularly accuse Jews who claim they can perceive and are frightened by and concerned by anti-Semitism in Britain. They accuse those Jews of claiming anti-Semitism just to sanitize the crimes of Israel or to bring down Jeremy Corbyn. I would suggest that this reaction is worse, far worse, than the anti-Semitism itself. It's worse even than indifference to anti-Semitism, because it imputes to the Jews malicious intent in claiming that the Jewish people is being maliciously targeted. It says, in effect, the Jews are lying. It blames the Jews, in effect, for their own victimization. This reaction is itself, therefore, intrinsically malicious and anti-Semitic. And so this reaction is, therefore, the inescapable evidence that the Jews are being abandoned. Those of us who have loved Britain for its gentleness, its tolerance, its decency, its stoicism, its reasonableness, and the dampness of both its weather and national temperament, feel as if we have been orphaned, but we surely have been living in a fool's paradise. Some people think Europe is over, that the demographics are against it, and that it will become a majority Muslim culture in a few decades. Who knows? I don't. My guess, though, is that Europe will not go down without a fight. If that happens, the Jews are likely to get it in the neck from all sides. Whichever way it goes, it's not a pleasant prospect. So, to the question you all want me to answer, is it time to leave? It's very personal, and I wouldn't presume to advise anyone what to do. I can only speak for myself and say that for some years now, I've been spending a very great deal of my time in Israel. Because even with 150,000 Hezbollah rockets pointing at us from Lebanon, even with Hamas trying every day to murder us, and with Iran working towards its genocide bomb to wipe us out, Israel is where I feel so much safer and where the air is so much sweeter. And it's where Jews are not on their knees and where no one will ever make me feel I am not entitled to live there and don't properly belong. Israel is where we have astonishingly renewed ourselves as a nation out of the ashes of the Shoah. Israel is where all those who want us gone meet their nemesis in the political realization of the eternal people. Israel is the ultimate and ultimately the only definitive and triumphant repudiation of anti-Semitism and the true vindication of the millions of us who perished in the unspeakable events that we memorialize today. Thank you very much.
Well, Melanie, I think that reaction says it all. What a magnificent tour de force through the subject, and has probably left many questions. Now, we do not have much time for questions. We have until 9:30 or so. So I'm going to be brave and ask people who would like to ask questions to maybe file up in a line here, and we'll see how many of you we can go through. And Yoni, perhaps is there a microphone somewhere that people could use when they... Sorry? Ah, there's one over there, right. So if you come this way, and Yoni will hold the microphone, or somebody will hold the microphone, and then if you'd like to ask a question, we'll probably get 5 or 6 only. So first 5 or 6 people who want to come out, please, and come over here, and Melanie will address and respond. Come over.
Hello, Melanie. I've heard you say in the past that Muslim immigrants that come here should conform entirely to British law and not have parallel laws. But the point of that is eventually they're going to expand in number and eventually take over that way. So the first point I thought was quite irrelevant to what's going to happen inevitably in the future. So what do you think of that?
We're taking several together.
We're going to take a few in a row. And by the way, that was a perfect length of question. Not a long story, but got to the point. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, John Fenner. May I ask you to turn your view further west? You haven't mentioned the States because we were dealing with Europe and the Britain. What is your view of the States? Are Jews going to be safe in that country?
Thank you.
The United States.
The Board of Deputies, since its foundation in 1760, has always been scrupulously neutral in who it endorses or does not choose to endorse in national politics. Is it about time, in view of the opinion polls at the moment, that they took the unprecedented step of warning Jewish voters against the Labour Party?
You recently wrote a very powerful article on anti-Semitism. Maybe The Guardian wouldn't have published it, but The Times did. I wonder what the reaction of the Times readers was to what you wrote.
Should we take those? Yeah. Right, we'll take those as a starter, and if you want to sit down, everyone else can wait there and we'll get to you. But nobody else come up, please.
I remember your father.
I'll take them backwards. The reaction of the Times readers to the anti-Semitism column I wrote, somehow, for some reason, whatever I write seems to get people rather excited. And normally, when I write for the Times about a host of subjects, I get a tremendous amount, well, not a tremendous amount, I get a certain amount of anti-Semitic abuse in the readers' threads. Sometimes it's taken off and sometimes it's not taken off. On that particular occasion, everybody was waiting for it, and the Times moderators put on their tin helmets and unsheathed their rubber swords and did battle, I believe, on my behalf, because there was virtually nothing of any exceptional nature or of any ghastly nature on that thread, as I recall. So that was quite unusual. So most of the time when I'm writing about, the crisis in policing or the collapse of the National Health Service, anti-Semites come out of the woodwork and start throwing things at me and no one even notices. But on this occasion, everybody was prepared, and so there wasn't very much of it, if any at all. The Board of Deputies is neutral over politics, scrupulously so, but should it now warn Jewish voters against the Labour Party? Do you think the Board of Deputies needs to warn Jewish voters against the Labour Party? I don't really think so. What I would like the Board of Deputies to do, what I would like our Jewish leaders to do, is, I was so astonished, I nearly fell off my chair eating my breakfast that morning when the guy from the Jewish Leadership Council went on the Today programme and said, "I've never heard any of us do anything like this before in my life ever." And I thought, that's about it. You never will do it again, will you? And I would like them to put their heads above the parapet more frequently and to call out anti-Israelism for what it is, to start teaching the British people about quite what lies are being told about Israel and what the effect of those lies is, and to start talking about Muslim anti-Semitism. That's where the battleground is, not with Jeremy Corbyn, because the rot is out there. As I said in my remarks, if Jeremy Corbyn were to decide tomorrow that, you know what, I really think I'm a Conservative after all and join the Conservative Party, I'm afraid to say that anti-Semitism would still be coursing through British society as badly as it ever did. In the United States, are the Jews safe there? Well, yes and no. It depends where you are. If you are a Jewish student on an American campus, you are not safe at all. I was invited to speak, would you believe, I was invited to speak a year or so ago at Berkeley Hillel, and my talk was cancelled because they couldn't guarantee my safety. I did give a talk on Berkeley campus in secret. I was offered the chance to speak in a safe house. I thought this was extremely exciting. I'd never spoken in a safe house before. And then my excitement was slightly tempered when I discovered that the safe house was run by the Chabad. God bless them. Anyway, I spoke in the safe house, and afterwards the students came up to me and said, thank you, thank you, thank you for standing up for us. And I said, well, we're in a safe house. I'm not standing up anywhere. And I mean, this is the reality of being a Jewish student at Berkeley. There is, this anti-Israelism is vicious and violent in America. I really do hesitate to say this, but Jews are safe at the moment because of President Trump. Sorry, I didn't say that. But if the Democratic Party returns to power in America, do you think that the Jews of America are going to be safe? Because I don't. I think it's a Corbyn situation for them. And the first question was, I have said in the past that Muslims should be made to observe one law for all, but even if that were the case, the lady who asked the question suggests, it wouldn't stop them taking over because they are expanding in number. I really think that's not the point. It's not the numbers that matter. It's the fact that the culture that so many of them bring with them is one that they don't feel should be made to fit into the host culture, and that the host culture instead should be made to fit in with them. And that is unique, as far as I know, amongst minorities. Minorities have always been welcomed into a liberal society on the basis that the minority is free to practice its religion and its culture and to organize communities of faith and so on and so forth, but under the umbrella of the overarching laws of the country and basic customs and traditions of the country to which it must adhere. Otherwise, you don't have a country, you just have a sort of balkanized system of separate groups. And many Muslims in Britain want that. They want to live under the umbrella of one law for all. They want human rights that come with that because they don't want the other. But there are too many Muslims who don't want that. And so they live under a parallel jurisdiction of Sharia courts. And Sharia law, unlike our Bate Din and the halakha, Jews always live according to the rule, the law of the land is the law. Our Jewish laws are subservient to the law of the land. And that's the system that should obtain with Muslims, as with everybody else. And so I think that if that were the case, and if not just about law, but in culture, if people stop dancing to the tune of this extremist view that, for example, no newspaper can publish anything about Islam that Muslims feel is offensive. No other community dictates to newspapers like this, and no newspaper, as far as I can see, ever goes against this. They're absolutely petrified. They just do not ever report properly on Islam. They can't. They can't because they're terrified. They're frightened that their newsagents will be burned down. And that's wrong. And that's happened because Britain has allowed it to happen, because Britain has not had the confidence to draw the line in the sand and say, a liberal society says thus far but no further. Britain has got very, very confused and thinks that liberalism means that everybody has the right to do everything that they want and nobody has the right to say, my values trump yours. Well, that's the way a liberal society dies. And so I don't agree with the lady who asked me. I do think it's terribly important that the host culture, liberal society, lays down those liberal rules.
Right. We need you to be very quick, but we'll get through all of you if you're very quick with your questions.
Can I have a microphone? Yes. Ms. Phillips, this is a outside-the-box query. It's more worthy of a new Freud, but since you made this metamorphosis from left-wingery to what you are today, you evolved, you grew up, I wonder if you could explain to me, I have my own answers, but I would defer to you. How and why is it that Jewish community in the United States and in Britain, but especially the American one, most extraordinarily successful, ahead of all its peers, all other competitors, succeeded in every domain, in every possible aspect of life? They are ideologically and politically retarded. How come that they have not evolved with the times? They are still stuck with their Bob and Zeta as they came off the boats at Ellis Island, still embrace left-winger in the Democrats.
Okay.
The same
We've
applies
got the
to
point.
you.
Thank you. Thank you, very good.
Melanie, if we were all to go to live in Israel, the diaspora would be decimated. Is it not a fact that a strong diaspora is very important to the Israel's security and long-term ability to survive?
Okay, thank you. Next.
This should be short. It could be a little bit offensive. I apologise, Johnny, and to yourself. Thank you very much for coming down and taking your time to see us. Putting our security and the Jewish community to one side, it would be nice to know if there are any non-Jewish people here present tonight, but if most likely not, how is this message being passed out to the non-Jewish community, whether it's them just standing silently, taking part, but being held in the centre, not knowing which sides to turn to?
Okay, thanks.
There are some non-Jews here, and I'm English. My question is, Islam to me looks like a well-built war machine. I know you don't quite agree.
Islam. Okay.
How can Gentiles help the Jews in this country?
Well, this actually touches on the two questions about non-Jewish reaction. You spoke of Jewish people feeling orphaned in where they thought they had a safe home. And I think it's important that the anti-Semitism is also acknowledged as a universal affront, and that I don't think there's a forensic Christian voice apparent in this country, and I don't want Christian reaction to be characterised by what's heard on the BBC from Giles Fraser and people like that. What do you think Christians should be doing?
Okay, thank you all. If you'll take your seats again, and Melanie, over to you.
Gosh, what simple questions. Are US Jews who vote Democrat retarded? Politically retarded. The question is why they all vote Democrat. What is the phrase? They earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. It's a long story. People have written books about this. Why are American Jews liberals in the left-wing kind of sense? The short answer is because they're not very Jewish. Their Judaism very often, and it doesn't completely correlate, but I would suggest that, 70%, it's 70%, 30% broadly speaking, who are Democrat versus Republican. And I would guess it's something about the same proportion who are Orthodox, observant, and progressive. And there is an absolute correlation because progressively minded Jews, progressive in their political thinking, have kind of universalized Judaism. Left-wingery is a universalizing faith, if I may call it that. It believes in universal values, and in order to try to fit in with, in order to believe that they are on the side of left-wingery, and in order not to have a kind of any kind of rupture between their political views and their religious affiliation, they choose to interpret Judaism in a universalizing way. And consequently, they kind of have secularized Judaism, and they believe that those are Jewish values, and what they've actually done is hollowed them out. And so they don't see things from any other perspective. They think they are observing Jewish values, by clinging to the Democratic Party. And so they think they're actually observing superior Jewish values to those who are not voting Democrat. And it's to do with, I don't quite understand really, after all I've read, I don't really understand why there is such an overwhelming need to identify politically in that way, but that's what they do, and that's how they justify it to themselves. Is a strong diaspora important to Israel's ability to survive? No. Next question. Two questions really relate to the same question, to do with non-Jews. How can this message that I have given this evening be passed to non-Jews, and how can Gentiles help the Jews in this country? Well, the second question, how can Gentiles help Jews in this country, just by sort of standing up and speaking up, not just for Judaism, but for Israel? Because as I've tried to explain this evening, there is this distinction that's made, this is false distinction between, there's Israel and there's Jews, Judaism, and we are in favor of Jews and Judaism, but we're not in favor of Israel. And it's this kind of bifurcated thinking. And what Gentiles can do is to say that the lies being told about Israel are fundamentally anti-Jewish, and to explain why. And they can also help nudge the Church of England into restoring its old affinity for its Jewish parent, rather than trying to get rid of its Jewish parent the whole time, which is what it's trying to do. I mean, the Church of England, I'm afraid, although it will deny this at the highest level, it has been taken over by the theological, the sort of medieval theological thinking, which is called sometimes supersessionism, which is basically that the Jews really are to be damned, really, as not the party of God, and that the Christians have inherited all the promises made to the Jews. And this has been fused with the Church of England's support for Palestinians, so that so many in the Church of England now believe that the promises that God made to the Jews actually now belong to the Palestinians. It's a kind of spatchcocking of old medieval style Christian theological supersessionism with Palestinianism. And what Gentiles could do is start calling this out for the disgusting and illiterate stuff that it is. But I have to say, there are many Gentiles many Christians who are not only decent, not only understand and are sympathetic, but are horrified by what they see is happening, and have the interests of the Jewish people and Israel very much at heart. And that is of enormous comfort to so many of us. And so thank you to those of you who are here this evening and who embody that. And how can my message be passed on to non-Jews? Well, everybody should read my work. And the remaining questions, Islam is a well-built war machine. Well, that's a rather neutral way of describing a great religion. I would say that Islam certainly has a documented history of warfare, of holy warfare, and people who say Islam is a religion of peace have got it completely wrong. But nevertheless, one also has to say there are Muslims who interpret the religion of Islam in the way that so many of us think religion should be interpreted, as a source of spiritual comfort and moral guidance. And we must never forget that those Muslims exist. Nevertheless, the people who subscribe to the interpretation of Islam as a doctrine of war, religious war, of holy war, are in the majority in the Islamic world, and that is the problem that we face. And those who deny that Islamic extremism and fundamentalism and terrorism are founded in that interpretation of Islam are not helping us win the war against fanaticism and for democracy, freedom, and human rights. And anti-Semitism is a universal. Oh, that's right, a universal affront. What should Christians do? I think that was all the questions that we had. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I'll give just a couple of final thoughts on that, on your two main themes. I think what's very interesting about what anti-Semites hate, there are two things I think that Melanie brought out in her speech tonight that anti-Semites hate. Number one, they hate the facts. Melanie's lecture was all about the real facts of the case. Anti-Semites, anti-Israel people, anti-West people hate the facts so much they want to make up their own facts to replace the facts, which is indeed what Melanie highlighted tonight. And that is the basis of the madness that has overtaken parts of our society over the past few years. And the second thing they hate is a strong Jew who's willing to speak their mind and stand up for the Jewish people, for the British people, for all of right thinking and sensible humanity. And once again, Melanie, you have demonstrated that in spades tonight. Nobody's going to cow you. Nobody is going to put you in a box anywhere. You are going to speak the truth, say it. And I think for those of us pondering this question about whether to stay or go, I think the lesson of what Melanie has said tonight is, if you want to stay, you need to fight to stay. And we ought to fight to stay, and we need to be honest about the situation out there and how we can collectively help address it by speaking the truth ourselves. So let me pass over to Rabbi Yoni Golka to conclude the evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Diane Rebbitzin Binstock and Rebbitzin Dina and the entire St. John's Wood community, we would like to thank each and every one of you for being here this evening. We would like to thank David Dangor and everybody at the Simon Wiesenthal Centre for really allowing this event to take place, this exceptional event, and also to thank Lanny Ardno for partnering with us, and lastly and most importantly, to Melanie Phillips for her absolutely, her barnstorming performance this evening. And all I can say is when I next stand at this pulpit to give a presentation, I have a very hard act to follow. And on that note, we would like to say that you're all very welcome to join us for many events to come. We think that to be strong as a community is really important for our future here. So you're always welcome to join us. Next Thursday, we leave the darkness of Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron to celebrate Yom HaTzmaut. We've even managed to organize a 23-degree sunshine for fabulous weather next Thursday evening. You're all invited back for a barbecue. And we wish you a very safe journey home. Thank you for coming.